I want to thank everybody for coming out today. I appreciate it. And before I begin, I wanted to mention that this walk, like many of the walks that have been done, this 350th was sponsored by Historic Wickford organization. All of Wickford's buried here now, so they have an interest in Elm Grove, as I do. And today we're going to just do a small portion of Elm Grove. As if you've not been here before, you see it's a pretty impressive, large cemetery. And over the years, I've developed 4 different tours in different sections of Elm Grove. That's how big it is, and there's just so many wonderful stories here. This particular section, the oldest section of the cemetery, is what we're going to focus on today, and we're essentially going to go up that road and come back down that road, and there's just so much that we can talk about along the way. It's one of my favorite walks. It just really has so much interesting, some of the stories are quite amazing, and I hope you'll enjoy it. As always, feel free to chime in if you have ideas, something to add, question to ask. There's really no problem with that at all. 25 years ago when I started doing walking tours, if you broke my train of thought, I'd probably just collapse on the ground and start crying or something. But now the train is off the tracks in here, so not a problem at all. So feel free to interrupt me if you want to. And before we get started, I want to talk a little bit about cemeteries, because just cemetery etiquette. I mean, a lot of people, when I do walks, they're very nervous, so they stand out in the road. They don't want to, and believe me, I know a lot about cemeteries. I'll tell you a little bit more as we move through the walk, but this is my family plot over here, and in there is my father, an undertaker. Over here is my uncle, an undertaker. In there is my grandfather, an undertaker, my great-grandfather, an undertaker, and my great-great-grandfather, an undertaker. So my life has been around cemeteries, and as a boy I would go with my dad onto funerals and come here just to keep him company. It's a comfortable place for me, but it's not a comfortable place for a lot of people. And people say, oh, we shouldn't be standing here. We're standing on somebody's grave. It's disrespectful. And I disagree. I think that we come here and honor these people. The disrespect is if they're all forgotten. Because without the people that are in this cemetery and Quidnesset Cemetery and all the other South County cemeteries, we wouldn't have the place we have today. We owe them this for what we have today, and we also owe them to remember them, because they all lived important lives. From the slaves that are buried here all the way up to the captains of industry, they all contributed to what made North Kingstown. So don't feel bad about walking in on them. They won't mind. They're very happy to be remembered. And that's what I feel is the most important thing, that we remember them. So we're going to turn around first and talk about this one, because this has something to do with the beginnings of the cemetery. Come on up, folks. First, this was once a very grand cemetery plot. The posts that you see here all had large brass rails that surrounded it. Dr. Church spared no expense. He was one of the original founders of the cemetery, and that's why I like to start here. Sadly, vandals came and cut all the brass out of the railings in the 1970s and 80s, and it's a shame. We see so much going on in cemeteries, especially the smaller historic cemeteries, where vandals come and really are disrespectful to the place. But here, because it's a place that's been largely staffed throughout its entire existence, not as much of that kind of stuff is going on in this cemetery. Now, the cemetery was begun in 1851, and Doc Church, right up here, George H. Church, Doc Church as he was called, he had an office in Wickford, got together with a couple other important people, members of the Sherman and Reynolds family, and started to form a committee about, we need a public cemetery in North Kingstown. Before 1851, you died, you were buried in the family plot on maybe the old homestead somewhere. And at that time, in the 1850s, the world was changing and the way people lived was changing, and there's no guarantee that somebody's going to be living in the old homestead that has any connection to the folks in that family cemetery. And what would happen, especially if they were in farming areas, the person who bought the old homestead house and was going to farm the land around it, he wanted more grazing land, so he'd lay the stones down and grass it over, and it didn't matter to him. So people began to think, we need a place where we can bury our loved ones and know that they'll be taken care of. If we can't take care of them, if we move on to go to work in a factory in Massachusetts, we know we can come back and we'll be able to find where our loved ones are buried. And that was happening all across New England at this time frame. Elm Grove itself was designed a little different than a lot of cemeteries. If you think about Quidnesset Cemetery or Swan Point Cemetery, these cemeteries were designed in a very Victorian style with curving roads and fancy gardens and such. Here in New England, southern New England like this, they made up a cemetery here specifically that would make people in New England feel comfortable. It's like a big giant collection of family plots if you think about it. That's really what this is all about. It's not like, say, the veteran cemetery where you just, the person who dies gets in the next hole of the ground. Here, there's about family connection. It's really important in these old cemeteries, and that's what folks were comfortable with in the decades, the centuries really before 1850 came along. So when they designed this cemetery, that's what they had, what their thoughts were. They purchased this land as it was a farm itself, and the town members got together, sold off family plots, organized, set up a corporation utilizing the government of the state of Rhode Island to incorporate it as a cemetery, and off they went. It's called Elm Grove because at that time they planted and lined all the streets with beautiful elm trees. And if you look at old pictures of it, you can see the elms all down the streets, the well-maintained streets, which actually had street signs at that time. Of course, the elm blight came along and all the elms died. They were replaced largely with Norway maples, and now the Norway maples are all dying. So Elm Grove Cemetery is needing some trees, and it's one of the things that we need to think about as we move forward with the cemetery. But now Doc Church was intimately involved in founding this thing, as I said, along with folks from the Reynolds family and the Sherman family, and he picked this for his family plot. He was well beloved in the community, and he really didn't realize that the very first person that he was going to have to bury in his family plot just a decade later would end up being his son and his namesake. George H. Church Jr. was killed in the Battle of New Bern in the very beginnings of the Civil War. So imagine the tragedy that here's a man who's gone out of his way, donated his time and his energies to start this cemetery up, and the very first person he needs to bury in his family plot is his young son who died in that battle. And you know, there's a poem there to remember these, to remember this son of theirs. And I like some of the interesting things that are written on gravestones back, especially in the 1800s, because you know, it's almost like a haiku. I mean, they want to say something that is going to be important to kind of summarize the life that they are talking about here. Imagine how hard it is to think of that and then make sure that they get it right, they get together and they find out something to say to talk about their family member who is here now to rest for eternity here in the church plot. So again, Dr. Church was one of the beginning founders of all this, and again, he had to bury his son here in this family plot, the very first church to pass away here, and one of the earliest burials in this section of the cemetery. We're going to walk across the way and look at another very interesting gravestone with a whole different sort of a memories carved on it. We see on this gravestone, although this person is not buried in this lot, but he's remembered here. And that's another thing that happens in Elm Grove and all other cemeteries in New England, especially seaside towns like Wickford. You know, you lose your loved one at sea and he's gone, but you still want a place to remember him. So there's a lot of empty gravestones that are planted in Elm Grove with nobody there. And Eldred Holloway is one of these folks, and he's memorialized on this family marker. And it's an interesting story. It took me many years to figure it all out. Let's read it. Eldred Holloway, born May 9th, 1803, fell a victim to the assassin on board of the brigantine Crawford near the island of Cuba in 1824. An assassin. I mean, the anger still kind of talks here, you know. They were angry about what happened here. So what did happen? It took a long time to figure it out, but it's an amazing story. Eldred Holloway was a member of the Holloway family, lived in a big house on West Main Street in Wickford. grew up there. His family tradition had been they were either go to sea or they were ship builders, ship carpenters. Eldred decided to be a ship's carpenter. He learned the trade with his father and his uncles, working in shipyards. He got an opportunity as a man of 20, kids want to leave home and have an adventure, to become a ship's carpenter in a port in Montezana in Cuba. He went down to Cuba. By all records we have him, he did a fantastic job working as a ship's carpenter in the port. Somebody comes into this port, they've been through a storm, things need to be fixed. Eldred was the guy who will go out there and do it. So he had a great job out there. He worked in the shipyards there in Cuba with another young man who was from Vermont. We met there when he got there. In 1824, he decided he wanted to go home. He said, I want to go home and visit my family. I've been here for 3 years. My friend, I'm going to take him with me. They climb aboard the brig Crawford, which was coming back to New England, thinking that they're going to be able to spend a whole winter in Wickford. Have a wonderful time, get away from Cuba for a while, connect with family members again. Of course, remember, there's no phones, there's no way to really communicate other than mail that occurs occasionally going back between the United States and Cuba. Unfortunately for him, and unfortunately for everybody else on the brig Crawford, also climbing aboard the brig at that time was a gentleman named Alexander Tardy. If you ever want an interesting story, Google this guy. Alexander Tardy is thought to be the very first mass murderer in the history of the United States. Alexander Tardy had a history of going up and down the eastern seaboard, going to sea occasionally, and killing people everywhere he went. He loved using chemicals and poisons. He liked poisoning people with arsenic, putting arsenic in their food and slowly poisoning them. Once they died, he'd go into their rooms on board freighters and steamers and steal all their stuff, get off, try to sell it. He pulled it off an awful lot of times. One time he killed 3 people on a ship that was sailing along the eastern seaboard between Charleston and New England. He blamed it on the black cook. Said the cook put arsenic in their food, and the cook hung for these 3 murders that he did. When he got into the Carolinas one time, he decided he wanted to learn a trade, supposedly, and he apprenticed with a dentist. The dentist fired him pretty quickly when he realized that Alexander Tardy was not interested very much in teeth, but he was certainly interested in all the chemicals and things that dentists utilized to put people out. So he came up with scheme after scheme. He spent time in prison in various places in the Carolinas and Virginia, short periods of time for stealing from people, attempted murder. He got out and sailed off to Cuba for a while, and he was on his way back when he came up with another grand scheme that he had thought. By the time he climbed on board the Crawford, he had probably already murdered 8 or 10 people and had gotten away with it, essentially. So he climbs on board the Crawford with 3 accomplices that he met in Cuba with a plan in mind. He is going to hijack the ship and try to change the papers on the ship to say that he's the owner and the captain, and take it somewhere and sell the ship and its cargo. So the ship sails away from Cuba. They get off the island far enough so that no one could see what's going on. He and his 3 accomplices raise a ruckus out on deck in the middle of the night. Everybody runs out, and as each one of them run out, they kill the person. As they come out the deck, on the deck, and throw them overboard. Some of the people saw what's going on. They climbed up in the mast. Some of them were wounded. They fall off the masts onto the deck, and then they would kill them and throw them overboard. They kept 1 merchant seaman, who they wanted to keep to help sail the ship, because these accomplices that he had with him really had no knowledge of how to run a ship, and everybody on the ship else was killed. The first thing they had to do was clean the ship, because it was just drenched in blood from killing everybody. One of the Cuban nationals that he had put on as an accomplice was cutting them in half with axes, and they were throwing them overboard. It was just a horrific scene. And this is what happened to their son. He was one of these boys. Here's this 20-year-old boy wanting to come home for Christmas, essentially, and that's what he ends up having to him. It explains the anger. It certainly does explain the anger of this. They didn't say something lovely about their son. They're still angry about this, and they want to make sure the world knows that how angry they are. And of course, as time goes by, this is 1824, it's 200 years later, not too many people know about the story of Elder anymore. Not too many people know about Alexander Tardy. He took the ship Crawford. He had one of his guys scratch the name off the stern and paint a phony name on it, changed the paperwork, pulled into Norfolk, Virginia, thinking he would sell it. He did a kind of job that just nobody bought it. They found out what had happened. They were arrested. Tardy, being the coward to the end, killed himself. The 3 Cubans were tried and hung in Norfolk, Virginia. I mean, Tardy was such an incredibly evil person that the government of the United States were actually flabbergasted by how evil this man was. So the last act that happened to Alexander Tardy was his head was cut off, and it was given to the Army Surgeon General so they could study it to see what's wrong with this man's brain, what could happen. All 4 of them were buried in a pirate's tradition, which is why he got called the Pirate Alexander Tardy. He certainly was no pirate. All that they did was so repulsive to everybody in Virginia that they were buried off Fort Monroe between the high tide and the low tide, which is what you do with pirates. So they have no country, no claim to any country anywhere. And to this day, the 4 of them rest in the sand off of Fort Monroe off of Norfolk, Virginia. The little boy never came back, obviously, and it took a long time for his family even to find out what happened to him. It was months before they knew what was going on. His friend that he worked with in Cuba, his name is unknown. He was thrown overboard with Alexander, and no one knows who he is to this very day. So it's a sad story for that family. Somewhere, there's another family in this time frame who never got their son back, but it's a typical kind of a thing. But Alexander Tardy was pure evil. They assume he may have killed 20 or 30 people all told in his lifetime, and in the end went out as a coward by killing himself, as most people of that ilk could do. So it's quite a story. If you ever want to read more about him, there's a lot of it online. It took me a long time to figure out what happened to him, but I finally was able. I mean, I'm not much for computers. I really hate the computer age, but I sure do like internet research. I've got to say that. But it's great for me looking at this since I was in my 20s and wondering what does this mean to be able to finally have an answer to what happened to this poor guy here. So I come by, and when I come to visit my family plot, I come over and I pay my respects to the Holloway family and what they lived with for the rest of their days, knowing that their son had died in this horrible manner at the hands of a horrible human being. All right, we're going to walk over to these 2 plots in this corner and tell a very different kind of story. A wonderful place to talk about, of all things, 19th century Rhode Island politics. Now, we live in a different kind of Rhode Island where we're really are a one-party state. Let's face it, it's a pretty Democratic majority state. But in the 1800s, it was a different story. It was still a one-party state, but it was a Republican state. And the Republican Party in the state of Rhode Island was like fodder for yellow journalists. There was so much going on that was so fishy and so shaky and so underhanded that it always showed up in papers all across the nation as being one of the most politically corrupt states at that time frame. And this is a perfect example for us to talk about. These 2 gentlemen, by coincidence, buried side by side, but they have a very shared story. Now, the Bakers were an interesting family. David Sherman Baker, born in Wickford. All of his kin, his fathers, his brothers, they all went to sea. But he took a different route. He wanted to be educated. He went to college and got a degree and came out of college as a lawyer. Highly educated man, served as a lawyer, was very successful, was the superintendent of schools for North Kingstown as well. Had a fine house on the east side of Providence, near where his practice was primarily at, and a summer home here in Wickford on what's now Prospect Avenue. If you know the area well, if you go around the corner up the hill, there's a great mansion house there that has now been painted a kind of a lavender color. I don't know if you can picture it in your mind, or right next to it is another small Victorian era mansion house, and that was the Bakers' summer estate there. they purchased this plot. He did. He wanted it to be special. He actually purchased an extra plot, which was never used, so he could purchase and plant a ring of Lebanon cedars. They were very religious folks, and he thought the circle of Lebanon cedars would say something about his family and about his love, his family's love of Christianity, and he felt it was a message. And he had 2 Lebanon cedars planted behind his plot here. They were wealthy people. His wife is buried next to him, Anita Candler Baker. The Candlers were Massachusetts politicians, really hooked into the Massachusetts Brahmin, and in that respect, by marrying into this family, Anita's father had been a governor of Massachusetts and was a senator in Washington, D.C., that he was connecting himself into the bigger system. He was beloved in the community, but he only had one flaw as far as anybody could figure in his personality. He was a Democrat. It's like, what are you thinking? You're if you were a Republican, you'd do anything. Well, he was a Democrat. That's where his heart lay, and that's what he wanted to be. And he wanted to get into politics. He ran a couple times unsuccessfully, and finally in 1893, for the governor's election of 1893, he was on the ticket along with somebody that was selected by the machine, the Republican machine. It's interesting, at that time, the Republican machine was run by a couple of names that are pretty familiar. Marsden Perry, who was a Providence industrialist, and he's an amazing story in himself. They should make a movie about him. He's buried in Swan Point Cemetery, but he was a rag picker's son from Fall River, moved into Providence, and by the time he was done, he was the founder and owner of what eventually became Industrial National Bank, the founder and owner of what became the Providence Gas Company, the founder and owner of what became Narragansett Electric Company, and he owned all of the trolley lines in northern Rhode Island, southeastern Massachusetts, into eastern Connecticut. This guy had his hand in everything, had control of everything. He's extraordinarily wealthy. He really hated the fact that he wouldn't be let into Providence elite society, and he particularly despised the Browns of Providence, because they were the elite. They had the big fancy houses. They were accepted as the really important people in Providence, and he felt he ought to be in that group, and they would never let him in. He wasn't going to become going to dinners at the Brown houses or being taken down to the Ives or Goddard's estate on the shoreline or any of those other things. And he was furious about it. In the 1893 election, he wanted to thumb his nose at the Browns, so he went to Connecticut and got a guy named Brown and propped him up as his candidate for governor. A Connecticut guy with a last name Brown. He just wanted him just to show the Browns who was the boss around here. And he was running against William Baker as a Democrat. The thing was, there was a third party at that time. In the 1890s, there was a great temperance movement going on that eventually began and ended in prohibition. And so there was a temperance candidate as well. So there were 3 candidates for governor. The Republicans, just like they always had, felt, well, we got this in the bag, no problem. We always win. So the votes are counted, the dust settles, and lo and behold, in the end, they didn't win. He won. David Sherman Baker wins the election of presidency. Now, Marsden Perry and Nelson Aldrich are furious. They're furious. How can this be? They hire lawyers to search the charter of the colony state of Rhode Island, and they see that there's a word in there that they can use. It says the governor must be elected by a majority of the voters, not a plurality. And they say, well, he didn't get up to 50%, so we can say that he is not going to be a candidate. He's not going to win. We'll have a new election. They have a new election. The same thing happened again. They're still angry. They go to the state legislature, which is pretty much controlled again by the Republicans. In a joint meeting of the House and the state Senate, they decide that they're going to settle this because obviously it can't be settled according to the Charter of Rhode Island. And of course they vote, and their guy gets put in by one vote. So they think, oh, finally, we got it. But then something funny happens. William Sherman Baker starts talking to people in the background. And he finds out that some of the Democrats, some of the Republicans are sick of this. And some of them are going to change. including the guy buried over there in that plot, George T. Cranston, the guy I'm named after. Him and David Baker were friends. They grew up together. And he was a Republican senator in Providence, and he was going to change his vote. Brown was so incensed, or Perry and Aldrich were so incensed that they said, we can't let this happen. We can't let them re-vote because we won't get the governorship. So they take it to the Rhode Island State Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court, of course, is stacked like Supreme Courts are now in favor of exactly who's in power, and the Rhode Island Supreme Court unanimously says that they are declaring the election null and void because it's taken too long and they're installing the candidate that the Republicans wanted, the fake Brown who was in here. So this guy won the governorship of the state of Rhode Island, never got to serve. He ran a couple other times afterwards, never got there again, gave up in disgust after a while, and was disgusted with the whole political system. A few years later, buried next to him is one of the only governor that comes from Rhode Island, Bill Gregory, who was a big part of the political machine. He was installed by the same people who stole the election from David Sherman Baker. So here they are sharing, they're side by side for eternity. I like to know what goes on here at night sometimes between these three guys and that guy over there as they scream at each other about the 1893 political election. But that's the way politics was in Rhode Island back there. And David Sherman Baker actually legitimately should have been the governor of the state of Rhode Island, but the Republicans took it away from him. It's quite an amazing story, and it just tells you an awful lot about politics in Rhode Island. And the Bakers, fine people. He continued to serve in the community and lived out the remainder of his days. Actually was the keynote speaker at my great-great-grandfather's funeral in 1894 to show you how close they truly were. Even they had a connection that got beyond politics, and that's why we're certain that George T. was one of the Republicans who had had enough of Republican politics and was willing to give his vote to his high school chum. So, great story, and another of the many only in Rhode Island stories that you can find around here. Let's head down the way and we'll talk about another family and an interesting tale. Okay, this is the Grand Army of the Republic monument that was erected in late 1800s in memory of the guy I was named after, George T. Cranston, buried over there. He, like so many young boys at the time of the Civil War, joined up and, again, thinking he's going to have an adventure, just like the little boy ended up dying off the coast of Cuba. He had a boring farmer's son's life, and he wanted some adventure, and the Civil War seemed like that was going to be adventure. And the Civil War is an interesting thing to talk about, and it's particularly interesting because it came at a certain time in history when it came at the same time the Industrial Revolution came around. And what happened with the Civil War is that because of that juxtaposition of the Industrial Revolution and war, we finally had a war where we had found a great way to mechanize death. Before that, people actually did send their boys off to war. It'll make a man of you, because 95% of them all came back. But the Civil War was very different. Cannons before the Civil War would fire, and it was really just a big giant iron ball that flew by you, and if you just sidestepped it, it didn't hit you. Now we have cannons that fire projectiles that land in the middle of a group of men. They can set them so when they get there, they'll explode, and thousands of pieces of shrapnel and little mini balls will rip through an entire group of men and tear them to shreds. Big difference from going, whoops, miss me. Guns took forever to load, as you've seen people trying to load a musket. Takes forever to load and reload. Again, the projectile that came out of a gun prior to the Civil War was terribly inaccurate. Almost never hit what they was being aimed at. Just a round ball flying through the air, being buffeted around by the wind, and most times people missed. Now we have these rifled projectiles and guns that can be reloaded very quickly or can be loaded with more than one shell at a time, repeating rifles, and the bullets are accurate as can be. We have the beginnings of the Gatling gun, a machine gun. So war became a whole different thing. And boys were sent off to war by their parents, thinking it was going to be like, the other wars that had been before them, where everybody came back and very few people came back. The Civil War's death toll is staggering. We don't think about it because we just we can't imagine it, but the best way to quantify it is to think of all the people who have died in war in America, from the beginnings of when it was a colony. We'll start with the Pequot Wars and the King Philip's Wars. Add up all the people that died all the way up to the Civil War. Skip over the Civil War. Keep adding, keep adding, keep adding. You actually have to get all the deaths of all the people before the Civil War, everybody who died in all the wars afterward, all the way through the Vietnam War, into the war in Iraq and Iran, before you equal the death of just the people who died in the Civil War. Think about that. World War I, World War II, Korea, the Revolutionary War, the Spanish-American War, the Vietnam War. Add them all up and you finally get to the amount of people who died in the Civil War. That is how impactful it was in communities. And cemeteries like this are full of boys who went off to war and never came back to the Civil War. It really is, it's a startling number. I mean, the Vietnam War, it has impacted us forever. But if you add up the entire death toll of the Vietnam War through all those years, it just about equals the total of just 2 battles in the Civil War. Appomattox and Gettysburg. Those 2 battles, more people died in the entire Vietnam War. So it was staggering to communities, and the way they signed folks up in that time was also difficult for communities, because boys went together. They were recruited to meet quotas in communities, and they all went together. So the young men of an entire community could be all in the same unit, and if that particular unit ends up in a very difficult battle, the youth, the future of all of a small village, can be over in a second. They're all dead. All of them die in these battles. And the Battle of New Bern that we talked about with Doc Church's son is just such a battle. A small, insignificant battle, really, just a skirmish. But that unit that Doc Church's son was in was full of Wickford boys. And there's like 10 boys in this cemetery that died in that one little skirmish. It's really remarkable, the impact, not only the overall death, but how, because the way the units were set up, how impactful it can be for a whole community. So when the Civil War was over, the men who did survive it, because they weren't prepared for it, they never expected a war like that. Lots of them that were injured, and there were lots of them that were emotionally injured. The kinds of things that we deal with today with veterans with post-traumatic stress disorder, they had it in spades. They really did. I mean, their lives were damaged, many of them forever, for what they saw, what they did, what they witnessed. All of it was just too much, and really was a hard war on everybody. And in order to help them out, to find a place where they could talk about their war, just like with the veterans organizations of today, the Grand Army of the Republic, the GAR, was set up as the veterans organization for Civil War vets. They could get together and they could talk about their experiences in war, talk about how their experiences in war are affecting their lives at home. And they were a band of brothers that would get together and share the kinds of things that nobody else would understand. And that's where George Cranston come into this. He was a part of this. He ended up being the leader of the chapter that was for North Kingstown, which is up there, the C.C. Baker chapter. You see it, number 16, named after Charlie Baker, the older brother of David Sherman Baker, who went to war with George. And the chapter was named because he was the very first boy from Wickford killed in the Civil War. Died just a few minutes before his comrade, Doc Church's son. And he moved through the ranks in the GAR, became more of a leader in the GAR, eventually became the head of the state GAR, and went forward into politics. Started out as the representative for North Kingstown, then the senator for North Kingstown, rose through the ranks. And veterans issues were his biggest priority. One of his biggest priorities, veterans issues. He was upset about the fact that veterans of the Civil War were not getting care, post-war care. There was no veterans home for them. He was upset about that. He actually took his home out on the rotary out there, the old Cranston's Rotary at the intersection of Old Baptist Road, Scrabbletown Road, and Tenrod Road, and added a wing to it to be the very first veterans home in the state of Rhode Island. Then he convinced the state to buy a large house in Wickford, which is still there today, in an area called the Oaklands. The house was called the Oaklands, and turned that into the second veterans home in the state. And he finally worked up enough support in the state legislature, in the House and the Senate, to get monies for the construction of the Bristol Veterans Home finally. So George was their guy. He took care of veterans. Veterans were what mattered. George rode the train up to Providence to go to sessions, and he made arrangements with every conductor on the train. If a veteran's on the train and he can't pay his fare, you let him on anyway. You just write it down and I'll pay the next time you see me. So he would support veterans. He knew the troubles they had, and he was the friend of every Civil War veteran in his time frame. And that's why when he passed away, they built this. And each one of these granite blocks, each one of these names is a chapter of the GAR chapter in various communities, either named after an important warrior, a general, or a major, or a lieutenant, or else, like the C.C. Baker chapter, after the first boy to die in the community that it was in. And so this thing went up and has been here to this day. It's where we end our Memorial Day parades here in North Kingstown. And it's interesting, I talked to you from a couple personal stories, and the first is when I was a boy, as I told you. I came here to ride essentially shotgun with my father in the hearse when we were doing funerals in Elm Grove. And, you know, in my case, if you've seen one funeral or 150 funerals, you've seen them all. So I'd always wander off after a time. And my father would have to say to his coworkers, where's Timmy? And he'd say, well, you know where he is. Because I was here looking at my name. You know, I'm just a little 8-year-old boy and wondering, what's this guy's story? Because that's my name, George T. Cranston. So he could always find me. He always knew I'd be over here staring at this thing. And he always tracked me down that way. So again, as a boy, being an undertaker's kid, you have a whole different perspective on funerals and graveyards. I think just about 5 years ago, I was here with a group of Hamilton Elementary School students, about all the 5th grade in all of Hamilton. They're all out here, and I'm talking to them, you know, in a 5th grade appropriate version of what I just told you about war. And they're, you know, 5th graders, they're still at an age where they pretty much pay attention to you. It's not like high school kids where, you know, you're talking and soon they're playing with their phones. 5th graders at least are listening to you, but I'm standing here and I'm like, they're really getting excited. I'm thinking, wow, this is great. I really got their attention this time. The boys are all worked up, but then I notice all the girls are backing up. I'm like, I don't know what's going on. One of the boys comes up and said, Mr. Cranston, look. And right between my legs, a giant black snake had crawled out from this hole right here. And he was right there while I'm talking. These kids are flipping out. I'm like, whoa. I guess I'm not as exciting as I thought. Once I moved, the snake went back under the monument, and it was a great thing for the kids to tell their parents about when they got home. And then Mr. Cranston, there was a snake between his legs. I don't know if I like that story or not, but you know, it really, this is an important thing, and we forget how impactful the Civil War was. It changed communities. It changed the way people looked at war. Never again did a mother and father say, yeah, let him go off to join the army. It'll make a man of him. They didn't think about it anymore like that because the Civil War changed it all.
You end up with a lot of women that were not married at that?
Absolutely. You end up with a lot of widows or a lot of girls who were pledged to marry as soon as they got back from the war. They never did come back, of course. And as I said, people came back emotionally scarred from it. And there are so many records that I see in diaries and such of men who just, they were lost and they left. They came back to their families. They tried to fit into their families. And they got up one night and they just left. They just couldn't do it. And there's no support system, mental health support system for a Civil War veteran. Many times they went off and never were heard from again. I even see records of some coming back after 4 or 5 years and trying to get back into their family with their wives and their children, and some of them were able to work it out, but it was just an extraordinarily difficult time. a time that we just don't think about it in terms. But I do think that keeping an idea of how many, remember, because everybody who died was an American, both sides. So the impact that it had in the North, in the South, and in small communities across America was extraordinary. And of course, we have short memories, Americans. You know, time has passed, more than a century has gone by, and we just don't realize how important this war was. We just know we saved the Union, but the impact it had on individual lives are something we really need to remember as well. All right, we're going to walk down this way and head to another area. All right, this is if you just walk by here and you think this is just a big, giant, empty section of the cemetery, why is there nobody buried here? But the reality is it is a big, giant, empty-looking section of the cemetery, but it is chock-a-block full with folks buried here because this is the potter's field of the cemetery. This is an area that this large section of land was purchased at the beginning of the cemetery by the town of North Kingstown as a part of what happened in communities back then, where people took care of their own, and this is where people who could not afford their own burial, or who couldn't even afford to live, perhaps lived in the town poor farm, where they are left to face eternity in the potter's field. And it's been utilized over the years. It's an interesting kind of a thing to think about, that most of these folks were buried with sometimes no markers or very small markers that are long gone, and people come back still to this day to try to locate the fact they know that their loved one is buried here somewhere. Unfortunately, the Elm Grove records are in difficult condition, and there's not a lot of good record keeping about who was buried where in this potter's field here, but they do come back, and you can see that people have come. I think for the most part, people just want to put a plaque here. They know somebody that they're related to, a sister or a grandmother. Somebody is buried here, so they've put plaques in over the years, just so that they too have a place to go to remember a loved one who was lost from them. And again, there's lots of folks buried in here, going all the way back to the very beginnings of the cemetery. The middle 1800s, all the way up, this is probably utilized all the way through into the 50s or 60s. So it looks like a big empty piece of land, but only on the top. It's been used quite a lot over the course of the decades for taking care of the poor of North Kingstown. Again, because my grandparents were all the undertakers of the town, they also were the folks who buried all of these folks in here at one time or another, and they all got the title of overseer of the poor for burials, and it was a town title, and they took care of it, and the town paid a small stipend for the work to be done. But it really was a community service that everybody in the community shared in. As I said, back then, we didn't just ship people off to nursing homes somewhere. They had a town poor farm, it was called, where people would live in the community and stay in the community if they had nobody left to take care of them. But for the most part, people took care of their infirm or elderly relatives in the home. That's the way things were done back then, and it's a shame. It's kind of would be a much more graceful, dignified kind of life than being shipped off to, particularly in the middle 1900s, when they were large-scale places like some of the places up in Cranston, Rhode Island, where people were just sent off to live their lives out in a place where, in a time frame before a lot of automobiles, they hardly even got company or visitors because of that. So the Potter's Field is an extension of that idea of the community taking care of its own. We're going to just walk right over here a little bit to talk about another section of the cemetery that also looks like there's really not a lot here. This part of the cemetery is something that you also find in cemeteries where there are military bases. Here in Elm Grove, I'm not real fond of the name they gave it. It's called Babyland. And you know what this all comes back to, as I said, you have a military base in your community. And think about, you're in the military, you're assigned here at Quonset, your husband's going off to sea, you live in housing somewhere in the military, you rent in the town, whatever, but you're here for a while. You're here for, 2 years, 3 years, maybe 4 years, maybe even only 6 months. And, a woman gets pregnant and has a child who dies, the child dies in delivery or is born stillborn or dies shortly afterwards. And this is not your hometown, but you know, you need to have something, you need to do something. So cemeteries in towns that had large military bases had something like this specifically for that purpose, for a young child whose parents were assigned to the base, but this was not their home, but they're getting reassigned somewhere and they need to do something. So this area here was for that purpose. It's been some of the most poignant stories that I've come across as the town's local historian. Is about twice a year, every year, year in and year out, I get a call or an email or a text from somebody saying, my name is so-and-so, my parents were stationed at Quonset, Davisville in the 1950s, and I'm looking for my baby sister and my baby brother. Just this past spring, I had a woman who was coming all the way from New York State. She had promised, and this is usually how these things play out, she promised her mother, as her mother was getting old and was going to die, and it was one of the things that her mother wanted is, I want someone to go find out where, in this case, your twin sister is buried. She died when she was born, and it wasn't a surprise. The woman knows she had a twin sister. But then it became her mission. She said, that's what Mom wants. I want to find that person and put a marker on it. Because as you see, there's not many markers here either. Now, this particular woman, I was able to find out where her child was buried. She was actually in the Catholic version of this, which is on the other side of the cemetery. And I was able to help her put a marker in place so that she had the chance to fulfill the wishes of her mother, that she wanted a marker on this baby's grave. This had haunted this woman and so many other mothers over the years that I've talked to about this very thing and helped them find out where their child is buried so that they can come and place markers. And you see over the years, people have come, and that it's almost always a story very similar to that somebody has been asked by their aging parents to come out here and find the place where the baby that they lost while they were at Quonset is buried. So it's a sad story, but it's rewarding. It was rewarding. It's been rewarding to help all these folks find these babies and connect to them again and fulfill the wishes that they have given to their parents. That I'll go to Rhode Island. I'll find it. I'll put a marker there for you. And over the years, as I said, about twice a year, I always get contacted by somebody to help do that, and it's one of the more rewarding things that I get to do as a historian, town historian. All right, we're going to head out this way. One of the more intriguing grave markers in the entire cemetery is this one for William Turk. It's really an unusual one. They're pretty rare, and it's actually from a company in the late 1800s, early 1900s that traveled around the United States selling these. It's poured in place concrete. You make a contract with these folks to do this. Cemetery, there's this marker in the cemetery. You pick out a design, and this one here is the Tree of Life with the book of a man's life on top of it. You get exactly what you want carved into it afterwards. But the man comes out with a form that clamps in place, mixes the concrete, pours it in, and when he takes the rubber form off, you have this intricate concrete gravestone marker. It's a pretty wild thing. It's when I first saw it, I was just amazed by it. I've tried to figure out what it is, but it's cement. It's concrete cement, poured in place cement, and it really has held up well over the years. And it's an intriguing thing. The family too is quite interesting. The family of Jacob Turk. Jacob came to the United States from Walheim, Germany in 1840s. Walked off the boat, and somehow he ended up settling in Wickford, and he was a shoemaker, master shoemaker. He made high-end riding boots and such for the wealthy folks in Wickford, and also a lot of real craftsmen ended up coming to Wickford in the middle 1800s because there was such wealth there, and there were clients who would pay to have a guy like Jacob make a pair of riding boots for you, or winter boots, or special shoes, and he made them there in his shop in Wickford. The Turks stayed in the village, and I'm amazed by it. Imagine what that's like to leave this section of Germany, that time frame. I guess it was going through some real economic trouble, not speak a lick of English, and pack your family up and say, we're going to America. And, you know, that story comes over time and time again, and they came here with hopes of a great future for their family. And indeed, the Turk family did very well. The shoemaker business ended up drying up as Jacob left and his sons couldn't really pursue it with him, so they started a bakery in another place in downtown Wickford. Jacob's shoemaker shop was in the place in Wickford where the Place Pizza used to be, right on the street, and across, there was a building across the street in what's now Updike Park that the Turk bakery was in. So Jacob continues to work until almost to his last days as a shoemaker, and his sons run the bakery across the way. They eventually meet and marry a family that came from a very similar place in Germany, of the Glass family. They lived in East Greenwich. The Glasses also ran a bakery in East Greenwich. They intermarried, these two German families that came from villages right nearby in each other. And as time went on, and it's all part of what makes the American entrepreneurial spirit so wonderful. The next generations of the Turks and the Glasses realized that, you know, bakeries aren't really making it anymore as grocery stores started selling bread and such, and we got to do something else. What's the newest, latest, greatest things we can get into? And it was home heating oil. They got together and opened up and formed a home heating oil business that still exists to this day, East Greenwich Oil. So you go from a shoemaker to two bakeries, and then as they see times are changing, they need to find something else, you end up with these two families uniting and starting up a home heating oil delivery company. So really is a great story about the entrepreneurial spirit of people who came to America and what they could accomplish if they just worked hard together. And the whole story kind of unfolded for me as I was just trying to find out about this remarkable gravestone here. It really is quite a thing. We're going to walk down the way now and talk a little bit more about gravestone materials at one of the wealthiest guys buried here. Okay, we're at the family plot for Robert Rodman. Robert Rodman was the founder of the textile industry in North Kingston, one of the biggies. He essentially owned all of Lafayette, and his textile mill at Lafayette is still there to this day on the 10 Rod Road. He owned everything in that village, every building he owned. He also owned the textile mill at Shady Lay that is now an arts colony of sorts. He owned another textile mill that was across the other side of Tower Hill Road, the Silver Spring textile mill. He owned another small textile mill, which was located where Ray's Motorcycles is located now, and then he owned a large textile mill down in the Peacedale, Wakefield area called Rocky Brook. So this guy was way up there in the world. He was one of the captains of industry in South County, and you know, he ends up spending his days and living in his fine home, which is now the McKay's Front Porch building on 10 Rod Road, and living out a great life. And it's a great opportunity for us to talk more about the kind of material that almost all the graves in Elm Grove are made out of, and that's Westerly granite. Westerly granite is a remarkable material. If you look at other granite stones, you'll find that and of course, granite is a rock made of three minerals, and the grains in it, in certain kinds of granite, the grains of the feldspar and quartz in it can be quite large, or they can be really small. But what's great about Westerly granite, which is really found only in the area of Westerly, Rhode Island, and Pawcatuck, Connecticut, is that the granite itself has very, very fine grains, and they're all equal sized. And so you can see that if you want to come up to Robert's gravestone, what this gives you is, I mean, a lot of gravestones you see that are around here that aren't Westerly granite are marble. And when marble came out, it was great. It was, you know, something that you could carve. You could get a perfect mirror glass finish. It looked beautiful, but it didn't handle the acid rain of the Industrial Revolution very well. And you could see all the marble stones across the way, they're turning black, or they're being slowly eroded away by the acid rain. And many of the marble stones, especially the ones that are not deeply incised, you can't even read them anymore. But Westerly granite, with its very small grain size and very uniform grade size allows the same kind of carving to be done that's done in marble. And indeed, the Westerly quarries who employed carvers to make all these stones actually went to Italy and brought back carvers from Italy who had been working in marble for generations because they wanted that level of quality. And it really speaks to why there is a good Italian community that lives in and around Westerly now. Most of them can share their roots back to these gravestone carvers that came to work in the quarries. Every important monument that you see in every Civil War battlefield, if you go to Gettysburg or Antietam or any of the other ones, they're all made of Westerly granite. And the reason is because you can carve them with great detail. You can do a floret like this. If you did this on regular granite, the grains would be so large that they'd chip off. And you could never make detail work like this, or on the edge of this marker here. You can see the detail that's shown there. You couldn't do that on a regular granite. Only on marble, which of course doesn't hold up anymore, and Westerly granite. So this stuff is extraordinary, and as you go through a cemetery like this, you can see the kind of carving work that's extraordinary to think that this stuff was all done by hand by master craftsmen, all of them with Italian roots in Westerly, and all these pieces, including that giant monument to the GAR or this enormous Thomas monument in the back, were all hauled up here from Westerly on wagons and set up here in the cemetery. You can see, if you look closely, how many pieces are involved in this particular monument. There's a piece here, then there's a seam here, so there's a piece. This goes up to here, there's another seam, and then there's the top piece that goes into place. And again, deeply incised with the dentil. If you did this with regular granite, this stuff would break off because the grain size is too big. It wouldn't be able to hold up and be carved in this fashion. So this stuff is extraordinary. And you know, people who do carve monuments love working with this stuff. And of course now, if you know anything about Westerly and what's going on down there, the Westerly granite quarries, this stuff has also been found to be very good for making various grades of sands and gravels for, because of its even nature, for septic system design and road beds and such. All the quarries where this wonderful granite was pulled out of for generations from Westerly are now, they're breaking up this beautiful stone and putting it in crushers and crushing it down into various sizes of sand and gravel. So if you ever want to get, if you know a carver, a sculptor, if you really want to get them pissed off, just, what do you think about that Westerly granite business? They'll go on for hours, a lot more than I would, but it's an extraordinary material. I mean, this has been out here for 150 years. And it's, other than the lichen, which is a normal thing, it's held up through all the weather that's gone on, and it'll continue to hold up forever because of the nature of Westerly granite. And you'll see this here. If you really want to treat, go to Riverbend Cemetery in Westerly, and that is where all those Italian gravestone carvers are buried. And you should see the work that their co-workers did for them. I mean, it's a remarkable, and there's some remarkable examples of the gravestone carvers' art in this cemetery, and almost all Rhode Island cemeteries and eastern Connecticut cemeteries. You'll see that this material is the most predominant material in the cemeteries, and it's really unbelievable. But now, when my mom passed away, for us to find a piece of granite similar to the Westerly granite, it took me 9 months. And it had to be shipped from somewhere else, and it's not really even as good.
That's, I was going to ask you, so they're still actively digging it now, but there must be like a finite amount of it.
Right. Yeah, it's very difficult to get somebody to get you a piece and then have it carved. But you can still find it, but it's just not around that much. And you'll see a lot of other granites. They're brightly colored. They're Vermont granites and all these different. But if you look at the grain size of one of those gravestones, you can see. And you can see the level of detail that they can put in these stones is nothing like what you can put into a Westerly granite, a piece of Westerly granite. So it's really something special.
Would he have been buried in here?
Yes, he's buried. This is the family marker stone. You can see they're buried under these stones, these individual stones. That's a pretty typical layout for some of these cemeteries. You have this main marker stone where you write the things you want to about people on it, and then you just have initials. That's Robert Rodman, RR, right there.
So that's not a tomb.
No, solid granite, yeah. Big solid piece of granite.
And they're buried this way?
Yes. Yep.
I notice it's North Kingston and South Kingston. Is that
Yeah, I don't know why that is. It's crazy.
extra letter?
Yep. Everybody notices that, and I don't know. It seems to me it was a stone carver's mistake, but they just left it. Yep.
All truck and high.
Yep.
Jim, do you know if these children were the only children? There's 2 there and 1 here.
Well, no, there's a lot of more children now. We're going to actually go to Franklin, who is now for a guy who's essentially the equivalent of a multimillionaire in North Kingstown. It's a fairly modest family marker stone. We go down the way, we'll see Franklin, his son, who obviously had a grander vision of how important he was, and we'll take a look at that. But right now we're going to go across the way to this very old cemetery, which is actually a relocated family cemetery to tell its story. Okay, this obviously this cemetery is much older. This plot is much older than 1851, and this is something that happened kind of regularly as this kind of a cemetery opened up. People decided, well, you know, in this case it was because they wanted to utilize the land this cemetery was on, and they wanted to move these graves in here. But other times it's just people say, I don't trust the guy who I sold the house to. I'm going to move my family out of the family plot and put it in Elm Grove Cemetery so I know that they'll be taken care of. Because as I said, particularly in farm country, there's so many graveyards now that are been lost because of the farmers. Soccer field on Stony Lane, you're familiar with where that is? That has like 3 or 4 cemeteries in it somewhere laid down, because it was all farm fields and they haven't been found yet. So kids are playing soccer there, and unbeknownst to them, there's family plots in amongst that farm land there, but they've never been found. Some of the farmers just took the stones and reused them for other things and put them under foundations. A lot of them just laid them down and grassed them over and let the cows and sheep and whatever graze over the area. So it's one of the big reasons people move them. As I said, this cemetery, which covers this entire section, was moved because the area that it was in wanted to be utilized to build a house, a mill owner's house, where this plot used to be, and that's on Featherbed Lane in North Kingstown off of Anaquatucket Road, and the mill owner's house is across the way from the location where that textile mill remains are right there. That was the Anaquatucket Mill, and the Sanford family wanted to come in and build their house across the street, so they paid to have this entire Northup plot picked up and moved. Of course, these are all slate stones. Many of them were carved at the John Stevens shop in Newport, the oldest operating business in the United States. Pretty interesting. Began in 1709 and is still operating to this day with just 2 families having run it, the Stevens and then the Bensons. So it's a pretty remarkable business that's more than 300 years old and still operating, carving gravestones. You have some of the typical images on the slate stones that we use today. Really early ones have a pretty gruesome winged skull head. These have winged angel heads, common ones, but this one's a little bit different. I think this one's pretty neat. If you take a close look at it afterwards, the wings, one of the wings is back, and you see behind the wing is opened up is an hourglass with the sands running out. In other words, time's up. We're coming to take you. The people in this graveyard are interesting in and of themselves because these Northups were early Northups and part of the Narragansett planter class that existed in South County in the 1700s, throughout most of the 1700s, and they were slave owners. And has anybody here seen the movie 12 Years a Slave? And the protagonist of that movie is Solomon Northup. Solomon's father was Mintus Northup. Mintus was sent out to New York State with one of the Northups that were moving out there to start up a farm there on land that had been given to them as payment for due service in the Revolutionary War. He sent his son out there, and Mintus went out there. Mintus was a slave on Featherbed Lane at the Northup farms there, and Solomon Northup was the son of the slaves of these people right here. So we have this connection to that extraordinary movie. Those who haven't seen it, it's a remarkable movie because it is just so chillingly accurate to what the lives of a slave really was like. It's not a movie to sit down with your kids to watch. It's it's painful. It's a painful movie to watch, but it really tells the real story of what slaves were like. Now, Solomon was born free in New York State. He was a talented, educated black man. He was a musician, and he was traveling as a traveling musician. He got too close to the Mason-Dixon line, and in that time frame before the Civil War began, people were going up essentially and finding free black men and just kidnapping them and hauling them to the South and selling them off as slaves. And that's what happened to Solomon. This man born free, highly educated, an accomplished musician, somebody with a real life, was hauled down into the Deep South and spent 12 years as a slave until he was finally able to get one of the white Northups to come down and say, no, he's free, you have to let him go. But he spent 12 years as a slave trying to get himself free to get back to his old life. So it's a remarkable story. But the reality is that here in this graveyard are not only the very wealthy Northups who lived out there in their fancy stones, but also people who were most certainly kin to Solomon and Mintus. Some were buried back there with no markers whatsoever. So I kind of think you can imagine that it's one day Solomon Northup got free and he's traveling as a traveling musician. I can't believe it. He didn't stop in North Kingstown and come here, to see his roots, or go to the Northup House, which still stands on Featherbed Lane to this day, that his father Mintus had served as a slave in. So it's kind of a remarkable connection to the larger world that played out in North Kingstown. It's really quite a story and quite an interesting thing to have this Northup graveyard here at Elm Grove, and the tale that it tells us about the way the world was and what these people had to live with and deal with over the years. And it's a really super opportunity to talk about that story. And again, before we take off, take a quick look at that stone. It's a rare one as far as the image of the wings being furled back, so the hourglass can be seen. That's indicating time is up. Okay, this is the best name in the cemetery. I always have to bring people to it, Who would ever think you're going to find Cinderella Hoxie here and buried here in the cemetery? Now, Cinderella is interesting. It just, by sheer coincidence, I'm kind of related to Cinderella, which is her mother-in-law was Lucretia Kingsley Hoxie. There's a name for you. But originally her name was Lucretia Kingsley Cranston, and her family is just buried nearby here. But she married Clark Hoxie, and he eventually, one of their sons went down, worked on the railroad out of Wickford Junction, and met Cinderella somewhere in the South and brought her back up here, and she lived out the rest of her days. A Southern girl living in Lafayette with a remarkable name like Cinderella Hoxie. So it's pretty interesting, and I thought it's a great story. Sadly enough, her brother-in-law, Crawford Hoxie, also worked on the railroad. He's buried over there, but his gravestone has fallen down. Her husband, he forgot his lunch. Her husband ran and gave him his lunch pail. An hour later, he died in a train accident out there. So they're kind of connected in that respect too. But Cinderella is good. And again, I'm sure this was a marble stone. I'm sure it was beautiful when it was installed, nice and smooth and gorgeous, as are most of the Hoxie stones. But as you can see, if you take a look at it, you can actually feel where the acid rain has hit it, and it starts to erode it away. The calcium carbonated marble interacts with the acids, and it bubbles off slowly over time, and before long, we won't be able to read probably Cinderella's name at some point or another. It's funny, some of the marble stones that have fallen over and were just righted, 20 years ago, they are still pretty clear because they were face down and not being subjected to the acid rain quite as much. The rain was all hitting on the back of them. Or some of them that are like this one that have just tilted over a little bit, they have been saved somewhat from the effects of the acid rain on the marble, but most of them are being affected one way or another by it, and will continue to. We're going to walk down the way and talk about this pink granite cross here. It's unfortunate because this stone, just even a decade ago, was much pinker and more beautiful and less affected by the lichen because it did have some shade in front of it because there were trees around this plot. They've all gone, unfortunately, but this stone is still pretty amazing. It's a rare pink section of westerly granite, and you again get the idea of the kind of detail work that can be carved into and what can be created from westerly granite. It would have been a very special piece of stone, and it would have cost quite a bit. And what's interesting about it is the costs of this stone were shared by two very separate communities. The Episcopal community at St. Paul's in Wickford, where this man, Elijah Smith Thomas, had grown up, and the community in Wyoming, where his son was a bishop at that time frame. Elijah Smith Thomas, the Thomases were important members of the early Wickford community, and he grew up in the house right across the street from St. Paul's. His father was Allen Mason Thomas, who was a warden at St. Paul's and involved in keeping that church open through thick and thin, and the Thomas family were a very religious bunch. Elijah eventually went to divinity school and became a priest, and he was sent out on his first assignment out to be the priest at the Leavenworth Penitentiary in the Kansas Territory. And he was, it is said that he gave last rites to every one of the bad outlaws of the West who were eventually hung at Leavenworth. And so he got a reputation because of this connection, and it was picked up by a lot of the writers who were out there writing about the West in the 1800s and making up stories about the West and selling them to magazines and writing books. And indeed, he was given a nickname after he was left Leavenworth and was made the bishop of the Kansas Territory. I mean, that was a wild territory at that time. It was Indian country, and he was called the Cowboy Bishop, and he would ride from community to community across the Kansas Territory, giving services when he got there, and ministering to the religious needs of the very widespread communities that were in the Kansas Territory. And he was followed all the time by these journalists who made up great stories about the Cowboy Bishop of the Kansas Territory. He had a son, eventually settled in Kansas and stayed at home, and he had a son named Nathaniel Thomas who followed in his father's footstep and was made the bishop of the Nebraska Territories, which was that was all Indian land at that point. And he did the same type of thing, lived the same kind of life. Eventually he was made the bishop of the Wyoming Territories. So this continues with the cowboy bishops, the Thomas cowboy bishops, who went across the Wyoming, Kansas, and Nebraska territories during the Great Migration across the United States of America, and served all those communities. Now, when Elijah died in Kansas, he wanted to be buried back here, and the people of Wickford wanted to help pay for appropriate memorials for him. The people in Kansas wanted to pay for it too, and the people in Wyoming, where his son was now the bishop. A number of things were done. First, this very expensive work was commissioned at the granite quarries in Westerly to be done here, paid for by these three communities you would never in a million years would think would have a connection, but they did. The Wyoming Territory, the Kansas Territory, and Little Wickford, Rhode Island. They paid to have this monument carved and righted here, and they also paid for two beautiful stained glass windows to be created. One which is in St. Paul's in Wickford, and the other which is in the Episcopal Cathedral in Laramie, Wyoming. So these two windows celebrate Elijah Smith Thomas in Wyoming and his wife in Wickford. So all together, brought together by this crazy story of a cowboy bishop who grew up as a little boy in downtown Wickford. Great story. Gravestone, it's a good thing to talk about for two reasons. First is the material. You look at it and you think, well, that's kind of a cool gravestone, but when you get to it, you see it's made of metal. Yeah, this is a cast metal gravestone, and it's even more interesting is where it came from. Anybody got any ideas? Well, when we were all kids, they had their own motto. It was on all the TV shows. They have everything.
Benny's.
Sears. Sears has everything. It's a Sears catalog gravestone. You would order it, and there was a number of models. There's a couple of them in this cemetery. Most big cemeteries will have one or two of them.
Interchangeable plates on
Yeah,
the
you
side.
get to choose what you want on each side. You tell them what you want printed on it and how you want it. You send your money into the Sears catalog, and it's shipped to the closest rail station, and you can then pick it up. I mean, they did have everything. You could buy house kits, and the same thing would happen. An honor-built home, you'd get a kit to build a house. It would be shipped to a rail station. You'd have a month to pick up all the pieces of the house. And there are Sears houses in every community that has a rail station nearby.
There's one on South Road in
Yeah.
South Kingstown.
Yeah, there's a lot of them around there. There was one, a real nice one, that was where the Dunkin' Donuts is on 10 Rod Road now, a little cottage. They tore it down to put the Dunkin' Donuts up. But there's a few of them in every community. Whole catalog of them, and you could buy them whatever you want.
So what would this have been like, I'm sorry,
Yep.
compared to the granite? Would it have been more expensive, less expensive?
Less expensive, yep,
Okay,
yep.
cool.
Less mass produced, less expensive. You change the designs, what you want on it, and they made it in some factory, and Sears would sell them.
Is it hollow or is it solid?
It's hollow. Yep. They hold up very well. It's kind of a
Try to push it over.
yeah. It's seriously heavy. But it is held up here all these years. The story behind it, this is, in my opinion, the saddest story in all of Elm Grove Cemetery. And I actually don't even tell it if we have a lot of children in the group. The story is interesting because we talk about Jeremiah Smith. This is his gravestone, and his wife Eliza. If you look and see that she died on a certain day, and so did all of her children. And here's the story. Jeremiah is a farmer out in the Slocum section of town. Went off to tend the fields just like he did. His wife Eliza was there. They had a son who was 6 or 7. They had a toddler and an infant. He went off, probably said goodbye to the wife, and off he went to work the fields. Came back at the end of the day, back to his house. His house is empty. Nothing. Nobody around. Not a whisper of anybody. Wife's gone. Kids are all gone. Doesn't know what happens. He looks around the farm area for a while. Then he begins to panic. He starts reaching out to local people who live around him, friends and neighbors and relatives, and say, I can't find Eliza and the kids. I don't know where she is. I don't know what happened. So they start searching. Night comes, the next day comes, they're calling the authorities, the sheriff of Washington County, and they're getting together groups of people to search for them. Nobody knows where they are. They search for days and days. They cannot find them. Jeremiah is heartbroken. He doesn't know what happened to his family. They're gone. What could have happened to his family? He doesn't know. He goes back to the house one night after a long day searching. No more water in the bucket in the house. Goes out to the well, lowers the bucket on the rope down at the well, and it doesn't splash when it hits the bottom. So he gets a candle and a lantern, peers down, and he sees his entire family in the bottom of the well. So he calls to people. They come. They pull his family out of the well, and they can see what happened, how it's all laid out. At the bottom is the 6-year-old boy, next is the 3-year-old, and then Eliza holding the baby in her arms on top. So it became, Jeremiah Smith's wife went crazy and killed his family. We in this day and age, if you're a woman, you can probably figure this thing out. She had just had a baby, She had postpartum depression. And debilitating postpartum depression, and that's how she dealt with it in a time where there was no mental health professional around to help you. It was too much for her. Her husband was gone all the time, and that's how she ended her days, and ended her pain by doing that. And of course, Jeremiah had to live with that for the rest of his days. The guilt that he felt about it, and the whole story shows up, as many stories that I've learned over the years, in various diaries of people. The details of this didn't show up in the newspapers, just they were all dead. But he lived for the rest of his life with that guilt, and not only with that guilt, but the whispers as people would see him, oh, that's the guy whose wife killed his family, And you think about how difficult this would have been, how difficult it obviously was for Eliza to deal with this issue that she had, that we now understand, and how difficult it was then for Jeremiah for the rest of his days to live with the guilt of not thinking, I didn't do enough. What happened? Why did my wife do this? I don't get it. It must have been a horrible experience for all of them. He eventually did remarry and have some sort of a life, but from everything I've read about him, it was not the kind of life he ever dreamed of having, and was never able to fully recover from what happened there. And I find this kind of thing a lot as I'm doing research, and particularly looking in places other than newspapers and microfilm and such, looking in diaries about other situations that occur that have to do, now we know, about mental health issues. I've read about in diaries about people, in their 40s and 50s behaving in a manner that now I could easily say, well, that sounds like early onset Alzheimer's. But they didn't know early onset Alzheimer's for nothing back then. This was just another crazy person. One of these women, her husband went out to sea. She ran out to the end of the dock in her nightdress, ran off the dock and drowned in her billowing nightshirt that kept her from being able to pull herself out, and she drowned. And you see this kind of stuff over and over again. And I read about these things, and then you read about the aftermath. And people don't understand something. They want something. They want to be able to put something in their mind to explain it. And it's always explained the same thing. They went crazy. This person was crazy. That person was crazy. And I even see it as I go on and read, particularly about homosexuality in the 17 and 1800s for young men. Women were able, it seems, to hide it in some fashion, but and I can't imagine the lives that a young gay man lived with in that time frame. And I've read so many things in diaries about such and such a boy who died, and he didn't die, he killed himself, because he was that way. That's what they'd say. And he couldn't live, and he killed himself. And again, we now live in a time frame where we understand this is something that happens, and that people are gay, and it's not some choice they make. It is who they are, and they have to deal with it. And society has made more accommodations to allow them to live their own lives. But you think about the kinds of things that happen now that we realize are a problem. We have ways to help at least, but in the 17 and 1800s, they just didn't exist. And you end up with a sad story like this one. As a byproduct of it all. Any questions there before we got 2 more stops, and then we're set.
One child died 6 years earlier.
Yeah.
She had the 2.
Yep. Okay. Every cemetery that is from the 1800s has one of these, and this is a winter crypt. And you got to remember. People in the 1800s died often in February or January, and the ground is frozen solid. You can't dig a grave with just shovels. They don't have the benefit of backhoes and tractors and such to dig through the top foot or 2 of ice to dig a grave. So you need to have something, some place to put Great Aunt Matilda, and hopefully nobody has a Great Aunt Matilda. I picked that name out because I don't want to offend anybody, but you have to have a place to put Great Aunt Matilda until the ground thaws. And it's a crypt. It's a winter crypt. And then a cemetery like this has a crypt keeper, and that's when the 7th grade boys are just enthralled. Oh, yeah, I want to be a crypt keeper. They love that stuff. Crypt keeper, they'll go on. I'm trying to talk, and they're all talking about crypt keepers. I'm like, okay, let's talk. You guys talk about crypt keepers later. Let me finish the story. But that's the way it was. I mean, they had to have these, and there were a number of them in North Kingstown. There's this one, which exists still to this day. There's one at the north end of town in a large family cemetery off of, I guess it's off of Forge Road up there, a winter crypt. There's a winter crypt in Lafayette behind the McKay's front porch that was utilized by Lafayette residents. And there was one on the top of West Main Street where the bank is now. Records show that there was a winter crypt there for the use for Wickford people, built there prior to even Elder Grove being there. So these were necessary things that were required. You know, a good crypt has to be solid like this. Needs a good solid door because, you know, the last thing you want is over the course of the winter for great aunt Matilda's arm to get gnawed off by a coyote or something. So it's important that they're secure and tightly fit like this one. And I'm going to tell you, with my undertaker heritage, I know for a fact that when the first spring thaws came in April, this was a busy place because, you know, this is the time when you wanted to get all those folks in the ground because they were frozen then too. And once they started thawing, it was not going to be as pleasant a job. But the cemetery workers and the undertakers were very busy in that first month of April when things finally started thawing out, emptying out winter crypts all up and down New England in these kind of cemeteries. It was just the way it was. Very busy time. Even drive through places, I've seen them in places in Warwick and even other New England states where they're still there. They might be bricked up, but you can still see I see it in the back. There's the winter crypt for that cemetery. So they were all here and they're all interesting. And again, as an undertaker's son, this was a cool place, and you know, you had to at least go in there so you could say you went in there as a kid. Oh yeah, I was in there. No problem. And kids, I think kids still probably try to go in there. Some kids will say they stayed in there overnight. None of us believe them. No, sorry, you might have gone in there, but you didn't stay there overnight. There's none now. They're all, yeah.
Could they fit though?
There's a pretty good size one. They could stack them up. They could probably get 25 people in there. Yep. Yep.
It's on Forge Road.
It's way in the back. It's at an old historic cemetery, the cemetery that Judge Allen is buried in. It's beautiful. It's in the hill in the side of the cemetery, hand-laid stone. It's a gorgeous thing. You can get to it. It's on private property, but the last time I was up there, the homeowner was quite amenable to let people go look at it. If you look in the Historic Cemeteries book, Althea's book, you can look at the cemetery and find the exact house. Just reach out to them. It's really something to see. All right, we're going to stop and finish our walk here with our more pretentious Rodman. So as I said, Robert Rodman, Franklin's dad, he had a pretty nice family marker stone, but you know, Franklin obviously felt he was deserving of a lot more, and this is an extraordinary piece of. I mean, this is, you know, the stone carvery is considered a craft, but when you get to the level of detail in one of these, it's really almost become an art form. And this is a piece of art in my book. And to take a look at the detailing work on Franklin's monument here, and think about the realities of setting this thing in a time frame before cranes, with block and tackle and draft animals, trying to get this thing righted. And of course, it needs to be exactly and perfectly level. And it is indeed, so it will stand here for all this time, and without moving an inch. It's really quite a remarkable engineering feat just to get this in place, to haul the pieces of this up from Westerly, put it together, and have it stand here now, 150 years later, pretty much the same as it was when it was put in the ground all those years ago. Franklin lived also on Ten Rod Road, and his mansion house was extraordinary. And you know, he lived a good life. He was essentially the bookkeeper for all of his father's textile mills. He was the money guy, and he you know, took care of the payrolls and all the purchasing of materials, et cetera, et cetera. So he was intimately familiar with the operation of his dad's business, and he continued to run the business after his father passed away before him, of course, and he continued to work in the business until his last days as well. And of course, every tour in a cemetery has to have at least one famous person, so this is as close as we get to a famous person. Over here on the side, we follow down the line here at the bottom. We see Fanny Hartman. Fanny Hartman was David Hartman's mother. David Hartman, who used to be on Good Morning America. And David spent his summers in Lafayette in the mansion house that's still there to this day. At that time, Fanny and her husband were living in the in that mansion house and uses it as a summer getaway. And David Hartman was somebody who would spend his summers here as a boy in Wickford, and it's known still to this day. He comes by and greets his mother. He comes by here, and he's been seen here in the village, and he comes out here and pays respect to his family and his connections to Lafayette as a member of actually somebody who can trace his lineage right back to Robert Rodman himself. And it's kind of interesting to think about that. Again, it's always fun to have somebody who is a celebrity connected to the place. But he's kind of interesting guy now. After giving up his career as a host on Good Morning America, and he now is somebody who works in New York City and does documentary film producing. So he's hopefully maybe someday he'll do a documentary film about Lafayette. It'd be kind of interesting. But again, it's a beautiful piece of stonework, and it's something that's pretty remarkable, an example of what can be made with Westerly granite. So I hope you enjoyed your walk around the graveyard. As I said, I have a number of walks. As we get into, maybe in the spring, we'll do another section of the graveyard. But you can just see that we walked up one street and came down the other, and we had a dozen stories that are all in and of themselves pretty remarkable tales about the folks who made North Kingstown. And so I thank you for your time, and the sun's come out, we can enjoy the rest of our beautiful day. Thanks. Bye now.
So Owen Worcester was renting the